let people in when. So hello and welcome everyone. My name is Monica Jacko and I am Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for Workforce. And this is the first of a series of webinars we've arranged at Cambridge University Hospitals in the week leading up to International Women's Day on 8th of March. We've arranged a series of hot topic webinars to discuss just some of the hot topics, the burning issues that are impacting women. And today, the hot topic is domestic abuse. 1 in 5 adults experience of domestic abuse during their lifetime. This equates to 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 to 7 men. And if you look at ONS data for the last 10 years, on average, 1.53 women a week in England and Wales have been killed by a current or former partner. I would like to welcome our expert in domestic abuse, our guest speaker today, Sharon Livermore, who's a domestic abuse survivor and campaigner and founder of Domestic Abuse Education Limited, and she was recently awarded an MBE in the recent New Year's Honours List for her work in this field. Sharon will deliver her session around 45 minutes, and afterwards there'll be a chance for you to ask questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. We will be recording Sharon's teaching session that she delivers, but not your questions, so that you have the chance to ask questions in a confidential space. So without further ado, over to you, Sharon.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for giving up their time to come along to listen to today's session. I will be sharing my story with you, so please be kind to yourselves. It may be triggering, so if you do need to leave the session, please do. You can reach out to me afterwards if you do need support. So to start off with, as I say, I would like to share my own experience with you. So I met my perpetrator when I was at work. I was on a sales course and he was the man in the room that was walking around, pouring glasses of water for everybody, chatting to everybody, really full of confidence. And I thought, wow, this man is exactly what I'm looking for. So as you do, you start a relationship. And at first, the relationship was absolutely amazing. It was the tick box of what we're conditioned to believe we need in a relationship when we're younger. So I had flowers, there was chocolates, there was weekends away. There was all of those things that, to me, I thought, this is amazing. Over time, there was a few things that I would say, a few signs that potentially were there, but we were due to get married. So I carried on with the relationship. We then got married, and it was actually on our wedding night that things really changed. So he poured potpourri over my head and said, I don't like your wedding dress. How dare you wear that? And I remember thinking, hold on, what's going on here? Like, I felt amazing, but it was his control. At that point, he believed he had full control of me because we were then married. So I was so embarrassed. I was humiliated. I didn't really know what to do because I couldn't go to my friends and family that had just watched me marry this man and say, this is what's just happened. So I carried on with the relationship and lived through 18 months of every form of abuse, which we will talk about, apart from economic abuse. And eventually, I gained the strength to leave the relationship. I'd lost myself, my friends, my own identity. So I left that relationship. I then went to the police and unfortunately he got bailed because it was 2015 and at that point you couldn't prosecute for coercive control. I didn't have any physical bruising, so he was bailed. I then went to work. As usual, it was my safe space. It was what I knew. And 3 days later, I went to court during my lunch break to put an injunction through with one of my colleagues. Thankfully, she came with me, which was amazing support. But we went back to work and our offices were absolutely gorgeous. It was a converted barn. So inside, absolutely beautiful. But as you can imagine, the car park was a little bit dark. So we walked across the car park that evening, as we always did, and got into our cars. Now, it was November, so it was dark outside as well, and my car was newer than my colleagues. So we would start our cars around the same time, but my car would always demist before hers. So I would always honk my horn, give her a wave like this, see you later, and off I would go home. But that evening, she drove off before me, and I was left sitting in my car thinking, well, why is it so steamed up? So I looked behind me and went, oh, thank goodness he's not sitting behind me. Okay. But my emotions were obviously running high. I'd been to court during my lunch break. And it was at that point I then smelled aftershave and realised that something wasn't right. So I put my hand behind me like this in the footwell of my car, and I felt my picnic blanket. Now, that picnic blanket was in the boot of my car because I have OCD and I know where everything is. From that point, it is a little bit of a blur, but I got out of my vehicle. I walked round to the back of the car and I opened up my boot. And in the boot was lying my then husband with knives and cable ties. I managed to flee. Fortunately, one of the ladies I worked with and two gentlemen came round the corner. He did get me, but I managed to go down and protect myself, at which point he fled the scene. But what he'd done was spent 3 days plotting what would have been my kidnap and then would have been my murder had I driven off in the car. He had gone to my home, and like I say, he'd angle grinded through the door, stolen the spare car keys, and was in the boot with where the seats were hatchback. So obviously he could have come through, and his plan was to take me somewhere to end what would have been obviously my life. Fortunately, me running and opening the boot stopped that, which is why I'm here today. I now use my voice to empower others, and I appreciate that what you have heard is a harrowing story. I would not want anyone to go through what I did, but it is my reality. And that's why I choose to use it to educate others. And hopefully people then realise the lengths that potential people will go through and go to potentially take someone's life and control them. But by the end of today's session, you will feel empowered and ready to take on the challenge of spotting the signs in other people and really helping them to live an abuse-free life. So what can we expect from today's session? So you will learn about the forms of domestic abuse, how it feels to be a victim, the signs to look out for in our colleagues and those around us, some impact statistics, and how we respond and refer to somebody if they are experiencing abuse. So first of all, I would like to read this statement to you, this quote to you. Now, as you can see, this is not me. This is Lauren Laverne. She is a radio DJ and presenter and also a domestic abuse survivor. When I went through abuse, I found it really, really hard to try and explain to people that hadn't experienced abuse what it felt like. Now, everybody's experience is different. I'd like to read this to you because it really resonated with me. So what I remember most about emotional abuse is that it's like being put in a box. In there is the biggest trick. Maybe you think it's a treasure box at first and you're in there because you're special. Soon that box starts to shrink, and every time you touch the edges, there is an argument. So you try to make yourself fit. You curl up, become smaller, quieter, and remove the offensive parts of your personality. You eliminate people and interests, and you change your behaviour. But still that box gets smaller and you think it's your fault. So for me, this really did resonate, as I say, how it felt personally. Other people will be different, but this is a really useful way of potentially describing to people that haven't experienced abuse what it can feel like. So what is domestic abuse? Now, domestic abuse is the power and control of one person over another person aged over 16, so really important, who they are personally connected with. So automatically we think of the husband, the wife, the spouse, the partner, but it can also be extended family members. So that is something we really need to be mindful of. And it could be a single incident or it could be a course of conduct. Now, the UK government does have a longer definition, but obviously for today's purposes, some of you may not have experienced abuse at all. So to keep it as simple as we go through this process for you or this session. So this here is the Duluth wheel. It's also known as the power and control wheel. Now, this was created in Minnesota in America many, many years ago, but it's still a really, really useful tool for when we are speaking with people around domestic abuse as well, because people don't necessarily know what the forms of abuse are. And if someone comes forward and says, I think I'm experiencing abuse, or they're not sure, I've often used this as part of a conversation, because then it's a factual tool. It's not me saying, well, I think this. So we will talk through all of these areas. The reason it is also a wheel is because a perpetrator will use the forms that are on the inside of the wheel to get a victim to comply. Now, if they're not complying, they will then move to the physical and the sexual violence on the outside, which we will now talk through in a bit more detail. So the forms of domestic abuse, I will use my own experience as well throughout this just to bring it to life for you, but key tactics here. So we have isolation. Now, isolation is one of the, as I say, one of the really strong key tactics that a perpetrator will use. The reason being, if we're isolated from friends or family or colleagues around us, we don't have people to go to and get the support. And when people have support, they're stronger. So then they feel that they can potentially leave that relationship. So a perpetrator will try potentially to isolate a victim. Doesn't happen overnight. And for me, it was my best friend. When I first got with my my then husband, I used to go for dinner with my friend, and then he said, no, invite her round. It's fine, invite her round. I'll cook dinner, or I'll sit in the living room while you two have a chat. So he was there, but not there. And then over time, he would sit with us at the kitchen table. And then the next time, he'd make her feel uncomfortable. And then over time, she was nowhere to be seen. And that also was because he'd put a block on my phone of her number, which became apparent further down the line. But I was isolated. That was just one example. That was friends, family members as well. And I wasn't allowed to associate with any of my work colleagues. So if you don't have those people around you, it's so much harder to get out of a relationship because you feel even more alone. And also, the likelihood is if you've got friends and family, you'd speak to them and say, oh, this happened last night. And someone would say, that's not okay. If you don't have that person to say, that's not okay, then again, you may be living in this bubble yourself and just move forward and start to believe that potentially this is the normal way of living. We then have emotional abuse. So this is things like putting somebody down, calling them names. So for me, my perpetrator used to call me fat and ugly every single day, a number of times. Now, when you hear it once, you kind of brush it off. But when you hear it day in, day out, however confident you are, you start to lose that confidence. And when you lose your confidence, you're easier to control. It could also be playing mind games or humiliating them in public, or if they are with their friends and family in that situation. And then we have gaslighting. So gaslighting is a much more commonly used term, and it's a subtle form of emotional manipulation. And it results in the victim doubting their perception of reality. The perpetrator will correct what they say, their thinking, contradicts their statements, dismisses their emotions. So then the victim's left feeling really, really vulnerable, and living in, again, as I say, this space for me that I was in. I wasn't really sure what was right, what was wrong, what was happening. So again, really, really subtle, but over time, the emotional abuse is actually much harder, or I found it personally much harder to deal with than the physical abuse, because it often lasts a lot longer. We can't just walk away from it and the pain goes. It is something that is embedded in you. You then have intimidation. So making them afraid or unsafe by using looks, gestures, or actions. For me, my perpetrator had a look. So if I was speaking to a member of the opposite sex, he would look at me. And one example of this is when we were in a restaurant having dinner. It was a male waiter. Now, I'm somebody that likes to speak to everybody, and even in the Tesco queue, you know, that's me. I will have a chat. So I find it really hard not to speak to people. But the look that I remember he gave me one night was, if you don't stop talking to the waiter, and I knew at that point there would be consequences when I got home. So for me, it was, do I not speak to the waiter anymore and seem very, very rude, which doesn't fit well with me? Or do I protect myself and not speak to the waiter and know when I get home that hopefully I will be protecting myself and there won't be a reason for abuse to start? It can also be things like smashing things, damaging property, abusing pets, displaying weapons, and then stalking. So stalking in its own right is obviously a huge area, but I had a tracker put on my phone that only became apparent after the police took my phone off me. So I was being tracked every minute of every day, and I had no idea. So again, stalking is a really, really huge problem when we are obviously talking about domestic abuse. So then we have Minimising, denying and blaming. So making light of the abuse and not taking their concerns seriously. Saying that the abuse didn't happen. So again, relating back to my own experience, there was one evening I was really badly physically abused to the point where I really struggled to get up off the floor. I went to bed that evening and he obviously came to bed, but the next morning he was standing there with a cup of tea. And I remember thinking, okay, so hello, how are you? Like, how are you? What's going on? And he said, oh, no, morning, let's go out today. And I remember thinking, okay, this is really strange. So I said, well, do you not remember what you did to me last night? And he said, no, I didn't do anything. He was gaslighting me. So I know I had physical bruising, but it was under my hairline, so all around here, not where anyone else could see. But for me, I remember thinking, but I know it happened. So how can you stand in front of me and say it didn't happen? And that's when your perception of reality, you know that what you know is true. But when someone is doubting you or saying that that isn't the case, it can be really hard to process. And then also saying they caused the abuse. So it could be you went to the pub, you should have been back at 10 o'clock, you didn't get back till 11, or I told you not to wear that outfit. I told you not to go out in that. So again, things that we need to be mindful of. So unfortunately, we have using children. So children do get used in domestic abuse situations, if not within the relationship at the time, obviously, excuse me, post-separation abuse, because if you've split up from your perpetrator and you have children, they still have a right to access to the children unless there is a court order. So at that point, they can be used as visitation to harass the victim still. They could threaten to take the children away, or they could report to social services. So imagine you've got that confidence, you've managed to leave that relationship. Your confidence is still going to be down. You're still not going to be in a good place. But then social services turn up knocking on your door. And of course, social services have a job to do. And if someone says there is a concern, they have to turn up. But it is a way of making that victim lose even more confidence in what they're doing and parenting. And then another example, which I know has happened a lot with many people that I've spoken to, the perpetrator may be due to pick up their children at 6 o'clock on a Friday, for example. The victim is just starting to get some confidence, getting their friends back, maybe booked to go out for dinner at 7 o'clock. But then the perpetrator will turn up at 10 o'clock at night because they know that they are then controlling that victim and not enabling them to go out and live their life still. The problem with that is obviously, one, this post-separation abuse and control, but two, you have children that are left standing there going, well, where's mummy, where's daddy, why have I not been picked up on time? So again, unfortunately, children do almost become pawns in these situations. We then have using privilege. So when I talk about this, I always refer, I have an amazing friend who is very happily married to her husband, and without sounding wrong, stereotypically, they have what would have been considered male and female roles within their relationship, but they're happy with that. It's consensual. So from the outside looking in, don't assume that people are in abusive relationships just because they have a different setup. This is when somebody doesn't consent to that relationship. So it could be that they're being made to have dinner on the table at 5 o'clock at night, and if it's not hot enough, it will get dropped on the floor, it will get thrown at them. It could be that they're being made to do all of the jobs around the house, for example. So this is where a relationship, when the balance is off and the victim does not have a say in how they live their life within that home. So something to be mindful of. And then economic abuse. So all of you that are on here today, I'm assuming take a salary, irrelevant of what that salary is. However, just because you earn money does not mean that you have access to those funds. And that's something I'm really passionate about, especially within the work, obviously in the working world. So for example, a victim's salary could be being paid straight into a perpetrator's account. They may have to ask for money for sanitary products, for petrol, for food even. And I know of examples where people have had no access to their money and have had to ask their perpetrators for money, and they've been given 10p at a time through online banking. And in the reference codes, there's been horrible words and names for those 10p's until they get enough in their bank account to even be able to go and buy a sandwich, for example. So something to be mindful of, especially in the workplace. Just because people are earning money doesn't mean that they have access to those funds. It could also be that they get asked or prevented from getting a job or keeping their job using credit cards or loans without and taking them out without the victim's knowledge or permission. Not working, so it could be that the victim is working a number of jobs, but they have a perpetrator at home that is refusing to work in any jobs. And then keeping their name off joint assets or savings accounts as well to give them that stability. And then taking family benefits. So, for example, child benefit. So 95% of people that experience domestic abuse will experience economic abuse. So again, something that's really, really important, because without finances, we do not have access to the same freedom and ways of getting out of a relationship as well. So then we move on to coercion and threats. So this is making and or carrying out threats to harm somebody, threatening to leave. Now, you would think if someone comes forward that's been abusing you and says, I'm going to leave you, that you would open the door and say, please leave. However, if you have been controlled, you've got no access to your money, you've lost your confidence, at that point, you're not ready for that unless you've got to the point where you can get out of the relationship. So then it's the worst situation for a victim because they're begging their perpetrator to stay with them. But the perpetrator is then in a position where they feel even more empowered. They feel they have even more control because they know what they're doing. They know that they're controlling, but they have a victim that's begging to stay with them. Threatening to commit suicide as well. That is something very, very common. My perpetrator used to do that after he physically hurt me. He would go and put a hose pipe in the back of the car because at that point, I'd be so embarrassed of my neighbours seeing, irrelevant of how much pain I was in, I would go outside and say, no, come in, it's fine, I'm sorry, come in. And as soon as I've said sorry, I have given him full control. So he used to do it a number of times. And again, it happens quite a lot in situations. And then making them drop charges as well. Unfortunately, statistically, it takes 7 times on average someone to leave a relationship. So even if they've gone to the police, they've started to press charges, they then get manipulated back again. And then obviously at that point, they will make them drop those charges as well. And then we have digital abuse. So the digital side of things is not in the power and control wheel. This is something that I've added in for this session because I think it's really important that we understand that the digital world is amazing. It is enabling me to present to you today, and I don't have to be in the same area, or I could be anywhere, which is wonderful. However, because we now have the digital side, it means that we are accessible 24 hours a day. And if we're accessible 24 hours a day, we are then accountable 24 hours a day to our perpetrators. So, for example, we have mobile phones. Often, even in the workplace, we have mobile phones with us. It may be that the perpetrator is wanting the victim to contact them every hour on the hour. There's so many different ways that this happens, and it makes it so much easier for a victim to still be abused whilst they're in the workplace. It could also be creating a profile page without their permission, and posting information online about them, sending threatening messages throughout the day to the victim. But also, what is the key way of isolating somebody? Sending messages or threatening messages to other people whilst pretending to be them. So as you can see on the wheel, some of these areas already interlink with each other. It could be posting photos of them without consent or using spyware. So for me, the tracker I have was obviously digital on my phone, and then taking away control of smart home devices as well. So you could have a perpetrator sitting in a lovely warm office and their victim could be at home and they don't have access. They're not able to change the temperature of the house. They could be sitting in the freezing cold. And then, of course, controlling their online banking. We have access to our mobile phone apps. If we do not have the password and the perpetrator does, they have full access to that person to be able to economically abuse them and manage or take their funds from them. So what we've spoken about so far is the areas that are on the inside of that wheel, which, as you can see, they all interlink with each other. And often a perpetrator will use not just one, but a number of those areas to get a victim to comply. Now, if they don't comply, they'll then move on to the outside. But these are the areas that a victim will do their very best not to get to because they instill the most fear. If you are physically attacked, you do not know if you're going to get back up off of that floor. So you will often do everything that you can to comply before it gets to this. But obviously, we do know that physical attacks do happen. The other thing as well is the sexual side. So sexual abuse does happen within domestic abuse relationships, and sex should be an act that is consensual because 2 people want to do it. It's an act that people should be happy, without sounding wrong, to do. However, imagine that you have been abused by your perpetrator, whether it be emotionally or physically, and then you have to have makeup sex. That is the most humiliating experience that for many victims, including myself, that had to go through. And then also, when we look at this, it's having sex against somebody's will. So being made to have sex on demand a number of times a week. So as you can see, there are so many different tactics that a perpetrator can use. And often, unless you've experienced domestic abuse, a lot of them, especially things like the committing suicide or threatening to commit suicide or threatening to leave, they don't really make sense until you have this kind of education, because they're all forms of using different levels of manipulation, of power and control to get a victim to comply. So we've now gone through what domestic abuse is and the forms that it can take, but we're going to now move on to how it can impact everybody. It does not discriminate, and that's something I'm really, really passionate about. So statistically, women are more likely to be victims of domestic abuse. However, it does happen to men too, as we know, and people of different ages, genders, cultures. Doesn't matter where you work. It can happen to everybody, which is why we need more conversations like this. So just to cover off a few of these statistics for you, in faith and ethnic minority groups, the Office for National Statistics data shows that in the year 2018 to 2019, the rates of domestic abuse amongst ethnic minority groups, they were higher than their white counterparts, and then highest amongst those of mixed ethnicity. And then ethnic minority groups also are potentially at risk of different forms of abuse. So we have honour-based violence, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and victims may also experience abuse that is perpetrated by extended family members. The one thing I will say is there are many charities and support services that offer person-centred support for individuals that potentially face different challenges. So I am partnered with many different support services, and I can send the list across, obviously, to Monica as well afterwards, just because it is about giving each individual the best support that they can receive and the best understanding. We also have, as I said, women. So 1 in 4 women in England and Wales will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. And then on average, 2 women a week are killed by their current or former partner in England and Wales. And then moving on to men, 1 in 6/7 men will be a victim of domestic abuse in their lifetime. And between March 2018 to 2020, 86 men were killed in domestic homicides. So already these stats are too high. We need to be doing things to bring all of these stats down. And then the LGBTQ plus communities, these stats, when I first had my training, they blew my mind, because I was like, wow, these are really high. So 25% of LGBTQ plus people suffer through violent or threatening relationships with partners or ex-partners, which is about the same rate as seen in domestic abuse against heterosexual women. And then almost half of all gay and bisexual men have experienced at least one incident of domestic abuse. And that's from a family member or partner since the age of 16. And then 80% of trans people have experienced emotional, sexual or physical abuse from a partner or ex-partner. Now, I have lots more stats that I do in longer sessions, but this is just to give you an idea that it can happen to anyone. And we really need to be mindful of the people that we are supporting, because they may face more challenges or different challenges. So why do employers need to be aware? That is a question that I get asked all the time. A lot of the time people say, well, no, it's a home issue. It's not something that impacts in the workplace. But as you'll see here, it absolutely is a workplace issue. So 75% of employees who experience domestic abuse are targeted at the workplace by their abusive partner. Now, that can be through, as we've said, the digital side. So it could be that people have got their phones, they've got their emails, but it could also be the perpetrator turning up at the workplace. But that is a huge statistic. So this is why it's a workplace issue. And then 56% of employers said that domestic abuse led to absenteeism, and 54% said that it caused the quality of their employees' work to suffer. And then 2% of employees lose their job as a direct result of domestic abuse. And I would just like to tell you a story, a true story here about a lady that lost her job. So I had this again as part of my training with Women's Aid. So she lost her job from work. She went to get support afterwards, and it came out that she was being domestically abused. What was happening to her was her perpetrator was taking her shoes. So in the morning, she couldn't go to work because he would take all of her shoes. And of course, if you don't have shoes, you're not going to walk down the road. You're not going to turn up at work. So she would wait at home, and sometimes he would come back and she would make it to work on time. Other times he would come back and she'd be late and she'd have to make an excuse. Other times he wouldn't come back at all. But then, of course, she hasn't followed the protocol. She hadn't called in before 9 o'clock. So obviously this happened a number of times, and her workplace weren't educated. So they just assumed that this lady was unreliable, wasn't doing her job, and didn't deserve to be there. So they actually obviously sacked her, released her from her role. And only when it became apparent and she went back to the workplace with the support of the support services that she was having help from and explained the situation, they actually helped her relocate to a different part of the country. They gave her another job and they supported her through the process, and then went on to have education and training themselves. So the purpose of me telling you that is, if somebody is absent or late, it isn't always because they're unreliable. There may be other things behind that that could be going on. And then we look at the cost. So £7,245 on average, that's the cost per survivor on lost output. And then 78 billion a year is the economic cost of domestic abuse in England. So we're talking about huge costs here, not just for the business, but for the economy as a whole. And then we just touched on this, obviously, with the story I told you, but 40% of victims were prevented from getting to work by their abuser. And of those, 72% were physically restrained and 68% were threatened. So now we know it is a workplace issue. What is it we're looking out for? What are those signs that we can look out for in our colleagues? Now, what I would like to tell you is, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, work colleagues are often with us a lot of the time during the day, and some of them do become friends, but also we know them. We know these people. So if we are noticing signs, we have a duty of care to those people around us. So first of all, we have the more obvious signs. So we have the physical signs. That could be visible bruising, a single or repeated injury with unlikely explanations. So for me, my perpetrator broke my fingers, and I wasn't allowed to go to hospital. I wasn't allowed to go to the doctors. So I strapped them up myself. And I went into work, and of course, everyone said, "What have you done?" I said, "Oh, I trapped them in the door." Now, I am clumsy, but if I tell you as we go through this, the other signs that I showed, if they'd have had education, they openly have said this, they would have picked up on more signs. So again, I'm not saying if we pick up on one sign that we should be assuming that someone is experiencing abuse, but if we're picking up a number of the signs, it could also be that they are signs of potentially mental health issues. But if that's the case, we still have a duty of care to look out for those around us. So it could also be a change in the pattern or the amount of makeup used. Are they using makeup to try and cover any injuries? A change in the manner of dress. So it could be middle of summer and everyone's in blouses, t-shirts, short sleeve shirts, and then somebody comes in a scarf or a big cardigan. Now, they could be feeling poorly. They could be really cold, but also they could be covering up an injury. It could also be substance use or misuse. So when you're going through abuse and you have no one to turn to, you're isolated from your friends. Unfortunately, a lot of people do turn to substance use. It could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be anything that helps them to get through. And you may see signs of that in the workplace. But then also they may be really, really tired. They may, in all honesty, not be sleeping at all. So for me personally, I am somebody who's suffered from anxiety since the age of 26, and sleep for me is part of that. It's something I have lived with for years, and I know how to control it. So I need my sleep. My perpetrator also knew that I needed my sleep. So he used to wake me up in the middle of the night. He used to push me out of the bed. I would then go downstairs and sleep on the sofa, or start to fall asleep on the sofa. And then as soon as I was starting to fall asleep, he'd come down and say, "What are you doing down here? Come on, get back upstairs." So then I go back upstairs. And for me, that broken sleep meant that the next day I was even more anxious and I was tired, but that was because I was easier to control. But in the workplace, of course, there was some days that I really, really struggled just to get through. Now, this one's really, really important, the changes in behaviour, because they are the things that we will notice around the people around us. And that is, the code of conduct is different, or the conduct, is out of character from previous behaviour. So it could be that they're more anxious, they could be quieter, they could be depressed, but also they become more aggressive. So for example, if someone had come over to me, like now, for example, if one of my colleagues comes over and says, oh, Sharon, you've made a mistake, I'd go, oh, blimey, what have I done? Okay, let's go through it. But if someone had come over to me when I was going through abuse, because I was so downtrodden, my confidence was gone, and I would see everything as an attack. If someone had come over and said, Sharon, there's a mistake, I could potentially have gone, well, why are you asking that? You shouldn't be saying that. That's not fair. So it's not me meaning to be like that, but you go straight onto the defensive. So if you've noticed someone potentially changing that way, again, it could be a sign. Also being isolated from colleagues. So were they the person that used to come for walks with you at lunchtime? They've met somebody new and now they sit on their phone messaging at lunchtime, or even after work. Did they used to come for drinks with you or whatever it is you like to do, or social activities, but now they're not able to come? An obsession with leaving work on time, that was me. So I also work in recruitment. So my role is sales based. I'm on the phone a lot of the time. If my phone would ring at 5:25, I had to leave at 5:30. I'd panic, I'd shake, and I'd pick up the phone and I said, yeah, I'm really sorry, I've got to go. Can I call you tomorrow? Speak as quick as I could, scribble down their name and number, and I would run for the door. Because if I was 5 minutes late home, it was an excuse for him to start the abuse. He knew that I hadn't stopped to meet somebody. It wasn't possible, but it was a reason for him to start that abuse. Someone could be secretive regarding their home life, or they could be worried about leaving their children at home. And then we touched on these areas with some of the statistics, but a change in a person's working patterns. So they could be frequently absent, lateness. They could also be leaving work early so that they get home on time. There could be a reduced quality and quantity of work, missing their deadlines. That person that used to deliver, that used to have that deadline done, no mistakes, all of a sudden, their performance standards are starting to drop. Now, again, of course, it could be other things. It could be down to menopause. It could be down to mental health. But again, these are signs that potentially could show that there's something going on. A change in the use of the phone or email. So for me, again, my perpetrator used to call my landline, and he didn't want to talk to me. He just wanted to give me abuse over the phone. So I was sitting there with the phone held as tight as I could, pressed to my ear, so my colleague next to me couldn't hear. And he would be screaming things down the phone, and I would be left going, yes, 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 yes. How many times can you say yes on a phone call with it being a normal conversation? He would then slam the phone down, and then I would say, okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll see you later. Bye. Put the phone down. Now, if I'm not asking you to listen in to everyone's conversations, but if you are around somebody and there is that constant strange conversation, it could be because they're experiencing abuse on the other end of the phone. Could also be the complete opposite to me. They wanted to spend an increased number of hours at work, or there's visits to work by the perpetrator. For me, my perpetrator used to turn up. We didn't have security. So he would walk in, he'd bring biscuits and walk in there, smiling at everyone. Hello, everyone. But actually what he was doing was exerting his control over me in that workplace to say, I can still come into your workplace. Very similar here. They could be being stalked. The employee could be being stalked around the workplace or on social media. It could be that the perpetrator is exerting an unusual amount of control over their work demands or work schedule. And then isolation from family and friends. Have you got a colleague, for example, that every Sunday goes for Sunday lunch with their mum and dad, and then they meet somebody new and you see them 3 months later and say, oh, how's your mum and dad? I don't know, I haven't seen them. It may be they've met the love of their life, and we all know this happens. They want to spend every minute of every day with them, and that is okay, absolutely fine. But it could also be that they've potentially met somebody new that's already starting to isolate them from their family and friends. So again, not in these definite scenarios or situations, but they potentially could be signs that something more is going on. So if someone is experiencing abuse, before we go on to how we respond to somebody, why would they not come forward? It could be that they don't recognise or want to recognise that they're experiencing abuse. They could feel embarrassed, humiliated, or ashamed. That was absolutely me. I was so ashamed that it happened to me and so embarrassed. And it took me quite a long time to process that it wasn't my fault, and to build my confidence back up again. The fear of making things worse within the relationship. At the end of it, we all know leaving someone in a healthy relationship is hard. So adding the factors that go with an abusive relationship. The fear of impact on their standings. So are they someone very senior in the workplace or potentially in the local community? And then people could be concerned about their confidentiality. The fear of being judged or seen as weak. So it could be, again, in the workplace, if I come out and speak to someone, are people going to think that I'm weak and I'm not able to do my job? And then belief the abuse is their fault. If you have been told for however long, days, weeks, months, years, that it's because you did this, they may start believing that as well. But what can we do? So we know now what domestic abuse is and the signs that we're looking for in the workplace. But how do we respond? So it can be really hard we almost feel like we're prying into someone else's business, but we have a duty of care. So there are certain things that we can do to make that easier. So first of all, listen without judgment. If someone does start to open up, and do not use language like, why don't you leave? How can you let this happen? Why haven't you told anyone before? You can use words like, are you experiencing difficulties within your relationship, rather than, are you experiencing domestic abuse? So just think about the kind of language that we use when we're speaking to somebody. Be prepared for them to be upset and tearful, and acknowledge their courage and difficulty they may be facing. Allow plenty of time and space. So if someone does start to speak to you and just potentially disclose something, even if you've got a next meeting, if you stop that conversation mid-flow, you could potentially stop them from coming forward to get support. So you may need to pop out and say to someone, can you get hold of the person I'm supposed to be in a meeting with? I need a bit of extra time. Have an open posture, really, really important. If someone's being controlled, the last thing you want is to sit with your arms crossed like a formal business meeting. You want that open posture. You want to create a safe space for them to come forward if they decide to. Suggest you go somewhere quiet and affirm privacy and confidentiality. Now, when I say that, in my workplace, I have 2 team members that like to go for a walk at lunchtime. So I know if I was concerned about them, I'd probably say, shall I go for a walk with you? Can I come with you? I have others that are in the workplace, and I know for pretty much 99% they would be more likely to open up in a meeting room speaking to me. So maybe think about those people that you are concerned about if you do want to start a conversation. And it is just asking people, are you okay? I've noticed that your behaviour's a bit different recently. I just want to check in on you. Now, they may never come forward and they may never get the help they need, but all you can do is offer that conversation to them. Be prepared, as it says here, for them to deny that. But what I will tell you is, when I went through it, if somebody had said to me, I've noticed you're not okay, I'm just checking in on you, I may not have spoken straight away. I may not have come forward. But what it would have done is reassured me that there are people there if I need them. And that would have given me a sense of security that I didn't have. So you may not see that, but by just offering to have a conversation with someone can make a huge, huge difference. And then our role is to refer people to support. None of us, unless we are trained, are there to save somebody's life. I'm not even trained to do risk assessments, so I have to signpost as well. So that is our role. After we've had that conversation, it's about referring them to specialist services that can support them best and give them that person-centered approach. So coming prepared with a list, or knowing where that list of support is, really, really important. But if you are concerned, of course, call the police. If they've experienced, excuse me, physical harm, offer to accompany them to the hospital, the GP, or the police station. Excuse me, I'm just going to have some water. So support the individual and ask what they need and be guided by them. Focus on safety planning. So we're not doing a safety risk assessment, but can we have safe contact details? It may be that the perpetrator is their next of kin, but if they don't turn up for work, who are we to call? Is it a family member? Is it a neighbour? If they then don't turn up and you can't get through to them, then call the police if you're concerned. And prioritise their safety over work efficiency in that situation. And then record. When I say record, you do not need to record every conversation you have with them at lunchtime where you've gone for a walk. But if the perpetrator turns up at work, for example, keep a date, a time, is factual evidence in case it's needed. So obviously, where you are there at NHS Cambridge University Hospitals, you can reach out for support through your manager or human resources, who'll be more than happy to have conversations with you. You can also reach out to many other national helplines. So we've got this National Domestic Abuse Helpline, we have Women's Aid, we've got the Men's Advice Line, we've got Mankind Initiative, and like I say, there are many, many others. And I know I've sent across to Monica a list of support services previously as well, and I'm sure I can see in the notes, the chat, some others popping up there. But it is about getting that person-centered support for that individual. So just before we wrap up, only a few more slides before we go into the Q&A, I just wanted to bring another couple of things to your attention. So as I've said before, we were talking about children. Post-separation abuse is something that unfortunately happens quite often in relationships when they come to an end. People automatically think when somebody's left the relationship that abuse stops. And actually, it can go on for months, years afterwards. And it can also be the same, if not worse, potentially. So if we have someone that comes forward in the workplace, they may need the same level of support or maybe more. So for me, something I'm really passionate about, because automatically, unless you've experienced abuse, it can be quite easy to say, well, it can't be that bad, they've left. So we need to be mindful as employers that we still have a duty of care after they've left the relationship. And then also trauma can be triggered long after an event. So for me, my perpetrator came out of prison last January, and I thought I had it all together. I was doing this, I was educating, I've got 2 businesses, and I was going forwards. And then when that call came, my world came crashing down very quickly. And I realised that I needed some adjustments. Now, for me, because I own my businesses, I was able to leave work at 3:30 and get in my car in daylight. Didn't have to answer to anybody, didn't have to ask anybody. But imagine I'd go on to somebody else, a new manager, a new business, and said, this happened 7 years ago, but actually, can I leave work at 3:30 and I'm not sure how long I need to do that for? Would they be supportive? If they've had education and they have a policy and guidance, I'd like to think so. If not, then I sit on the fence and hope that they would be. But I like to now talk about it because it was 2 weeks of me going home at 3:30 for me to find my inner strength and my confidence in my own time to then go, actually, no, I'm now going back in my car in the dark and I'm doing whatever I need to do. Of course, I still look over my shoulder, and I will do for the rest of my life, but I regained that control. And I think if someone had said to me, no, you can't, absolutely not, Sharon, you can't leave at 3:30, it would have made it so much more traumatic, and that trauma would have lasted even longer. So one useful tool for you, the Bright Sky app, you can download it on your phone. It's a free tool. It looks like a weather app. So if any of you are interested in finding out more, it has the signs of abuse. It's got a list of support services as well. It comes in different languages. So I encourage businesses to download this and individuals to download this onto their mobile phones. And then before we go to the Q&A, I would just like to read this quote to you. So this survivor I worked with since the start of her journey. She saw me speak at an event during COVID and reached out to me on LinkedIn. So we set up a time that was safe for her to speak because she was still with her perpetrator. And like I say, I've been on her journey since day one. Now it's her that has done the hard work. I was just there by her side, along with her employer, that really, really took this seriously and did amazing things for her, and have now really moved forward in their employment space to help other people. But I'd just like to read this quote because I think you'll realise the difference that an employer can make. So without the understanding and support of my employer, I literally would and could have found myself in a situation 10 times worse than it would have been without that support. They were there to support me when I had to reveal I was in a domestic abuse situation, when I had to reveal it was affecting my children's life, when I had to juggle legal positions in terms of maintaining my employment and maintaining being on the right side of law because of false allegations made against me. I needed their support. When it affected my mental health, they understood and supported transitioning me back into work at a pace that was right for me, bringing me back something normal into my life, to help reintegrate me, to be around positive people and a normal sense of living, without putting the pressure on and understanding that my performance will have suffered as a result of the ongoing abuse that I was juggling. Their support has given me a sense of loyalty that I already had, but an extended loyalty that no financial money can buy. That support when you're at your very lowest by your employer is such a unique and special connection that has powers beyond what an employer would know. And in return, I feel it enhances mutual respect, which in turn means that employees will stay with their employer for a longer period. So thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate there is a lot of information that has come across today, but hopefully the purpose of the session is really to raise awareness and get people thinking, to understand, like I say, what domestic abuse is, the signs that we're looking for, how do we recognise those signs, a few tips on how we can respond to somebody, but most importantly, our role is to refer. So I can't emphasise that enough. As much as we're human and we want to empathise, and I speak with victims a lot doing what I do now to signpost. And as much as I want to whisk them all away and move them into my home, I can't do that, and neither can you. But what you can do is, by being that listening ear and spotting those signs and referring them, you potentially will save their life, and you definitely will be changing their lives. So I will stop sharing my screen now, if that is okay. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll move on to the questions.
Lovely, Sharon. Thank you very much